Imagine waking up with no number telling you what to do. No alarm, no glowing digits, just the gray light beginning to soften the dark, and your body on its own deciding it was time to rise. This was not a luxury. This was simply what every single morning looked like for the overwhelming majority of human history. For nearly 300,000 years, your ancestors lived entire lives, raised entire families, built entire societies without ever once checking the time. Because there was no time to check. There was only the sun, the body, and the world around them, and somehow, astonishingly, that was enough. What did a day actually look like, with no clock to guide it? Not a vague, romanticized idea of ancient life, but the real, textured, hour-by-hour experience of a human being who had never heard of a minute, let alone owned a way to measure one. It began before waking, in the genuinely dark hours, with a body doing something it had been doing for millions of years before it ever belonged to a human at all. Every cell in an ancient human's body carried an internal rhythm, a biological clock embedded so deeply in life on Earth that versions of it exist in nearly every living organism, from cyanobacteria to elephants. As darkness deepened, a hormone called melatonin would begin rising inside your ancestor's body, not because anyone told it to, but because the absence of light triggered it automatically. As the first hint of gray entered the sky, cortisol would begin to climb, gently nudging the body toward alertness. No alarm was needed. The light itself was the alarm, and it had been calibrated by hundreds of thousands of generations to work perfectly. Your ancestor woke when waking made sense, not at a fixed hour, not at the same moment every single day, regardless of how the previous day had gone. If the hunt the day before had run long, if the night had been disturbed by a predator's distant call, if illness or grief had kept sleep shallow and broken, the body adjusted. It woke later. It rested when it needed rest. There was no number sitting in judgment of that decision. The earliest hours of an ancient human day were quiet, but not idle. Anthropologist Jerome Lewis, who has lived among and studied the Mbengele Bayaka, a hunter-gatherer community in the Congo Basin whose daily rhythms closely resemble those of ancient foraging societies, has documented something remarkable about how time without clocks actually functions. Mornings were often spent in low-intensity activity, tending fire, preparing tools, talking quietly as the camp slowly came awake. There was no rush, because rushing requires a deadline, and a deadline requires a number. Instead, there was simply the unfolding of a day that would organize itself around what needed to happen, not around when a clock declared it should happen. Hunting, when it happened, did not happen at 9 in the morning, because a schedule demanded it. It happened when animals were active, when tracks were fresh, when wind direction made stalking possible. A hunter watching for prey was not watching a clock. He was watching the angle of shadows, the behavior of birds overhead. Since startled birds often signal that an animal has moved through an area, and the subtle shifts in temperature that signaled the heat of midday approaching, when most animals would retreat to shade and hunting would become far less productive. This is the heart of what is called task-based time, and it shaped nearly every hour of ancient human existence. You did not gather for 2 hours. You gathered until the basket was full, or until the light began to fail, or until your body told you that enough had been done for the day. You did not eat at a designated hour. You ate when hunger arrived, and ancient human hunger, unburdened by a clock insisting otherwise, was a remarkably reliable signal. There was no concept of being early or late, because both of those ideas require an abstract, external measurement of time that exists independently of what is actually happening in front of you. For your ancestors, there was no such independent measurement. There was only the task, and the task's natural beginning and natural end. The midday hours, when the sun reached its highest and most punishing point, were not spent working harder to prove diligence to some unseen schedule. Across nearly every hunter-gatherer society ever studied, anthropologists have observed a consistent pattern. Activity drops sharply during the hottest hours. People rest. They seek shade. Conversation slows. This was not laziness. It was an intelligent, body-led response to actual physical conditions, uncomplicated by any guilt about resting before a clock-sanctioned hour permitted it. There was no 5 o'clock to wait for. There was only the heat and the wisdom of the body that said, not now. Afternoons brought renewed activity as temperatures cooled, but again, the activity was shaped by the world rather than by a number. Toolmaking, food preparation, childcare, the maintenance of shelter, all of it unfolded according to its own internal logic. A tool was finished when it was finished. A meal was prepared when there was enough food gathered to prepare it. A child was taught a skill not during a scheduled lesson, but in the flowing, continuous moments throughout the day when the opportunity to teach naturally arose, while skinning a hide, while sharpening a stone, while walking together toward water. And there was an enormous amount of rest. This is one of the most consistently surprising findings across decades of research into hunter-gatherer time use. Anthropologists studying groups like the Hadza of Tanzania and the Jew Hawansi of the Kalahari, whose lifestyles offer the closest living approximation researchers have to ancient foraging life, have repeatedly found that the actual time spent on subsistence activities, hunting, gathering, food preparation, is often far less than the 8 to 10 hour workday considered standard in clock-governed societies. Anthropologist Marshall Solins, in his influential analysis of hunter-gatherer economies, controversially but compellingly argued that foraging societies may represent, in terms of actual labor hours, what he called the original affluent society. Not affluent in possessions, but affluent in something modern clock-bound life chronically lacks: unstructured time. This unstructured time was not wasted. It was spent in conversation, in storytelling, in rest, in the kind of unhurried social connection that requires exactly the thing a clock destroys: the absence of a visible endpoint. When two people sat together with no number counting down how much longer the conversation was permitted to last, the conversation simply continued until it had genuinely run its course. Stories stretched as long as they needed to stretch. Grief was processed for as long as grief actually required, not constrained by any externally imposed limit. Craft and toolmaking followed the same unhurried logic. An ancient flint-knapper shaping a stone tool did not work against a clock demanding the piece be finished by a certain hour. Archaeologist Kathy Schick, whose research into the reconstruction of ancient toolmaking techniques has revealed just how much skill and patience these objects required, has noted that the production of a single well-made stone tool could take anywhere from a few focused minutes to many hours of careful, attentive work, depending entirely on the quality of the stone, the skill of the maker, and the intended purpose of the final object. There was no incentive to rush. A poorly made spear point hurried to completion before it was truly ready. Could mean a failed hunt or a wasted afternoon. The toolmaker worked until the work itself signaled completion, a balance achieved, an edge properly set, and not a moment before or after some arbitrary deadline. This same unhurried attentiveness extended to the preparation of food, the tanning of hides, the weaving of cordage from plant fibers, the construction of shelter. Each task carried its own internal sense of when it was finished, separate entirely from any external clock. A hide was ready when it was supple. A shelter was complete when it would hold against wind and rain. The measure of completion was the object itself, examined directly by hand and eye, not a number on a face that had no actual relationship to the materials being worked. Even movement through the landscape followed this same logic. Ancient humans walked extensively, often many kilometers in the course of an ordinary day of gathering, hunting, or moving camp, but this walking was governed by destination and purpose, not by a fixed duration. You walked until you arrived. You arrived when the walking was done. There was no concept of being behind schedule on a journey, because the journey did not have a schedule. It had a destination, and the body, walking at its own natural pace, simply continued until that destination was reached. As the day moved toward evening, the body once again began adjusting without instruction, the changing quality of light, the lengthening shadows. The shift toward orange and red wavelengths as the sun lowered triggered the early stages of melatonin release. Activity naturally slowed. Groups often gathered around fire as darkness approached, not because a schedule dictated a fixed evening gathering time, but because darkness itself made most other activities impractical, and fire offered warmth, protection, and light for the continuation of social life after the sun had gone. Firelight gatherings were, by multiple anthropological accounts, among the most significant social and cultural institutions of ancient human life. Researcher Polly Wiesner, who has studied firelight conversation among the Juhuansi extensively, found that nighttime firelit conversation differed dramatically in content from daytime conversation. Daytime talk tended to focus on practical matters, coordinating tasks, resolving minor disputes, sharing information about food sources. Nighttime, firelit conversation shifted overwhelmingly towards storytelling, myth, humor, and the kind of deep social and cultural transmission that bound a group together across generations. This nightly shift happened naturally, guided by nothing more than the falling darkness and the rising fire, and it produced some of the richest cultural material: origin stories, moral lessons, shared history that ancient human societies possessed. Sleep itself, when it finally came, did not arrive as a single uninterrupted block governed by a fixed bedtime. Sleep researcher Jerome Siegel, who has extensively studied sleep patterns among groups including the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Namibia, and the Tsimane of Bolivia, found that pre-industrial sleep was often lighter and more fragmented than the consolidated 8-hour block modern clock-based culture treats as the gold standard. People woke briefly in the night, tended a dying fire, exchanged a few quiet words, and returned to sleep, all without any anxiety about disrupting a schedule, because there was no schedule to disrupt. The night itself, not a clock, dictated when rest began and when it ended, stretching and contracting with the seasons exactly as the hours of daylight did. This points to something almost impossible to overstate. The very length of an hour was different in ancient life, in the sense that the concept did not exist as a fixed unit at all. A summer night was short, and ancient humans slept accordingly. A winter night stretched long, and rest stretched with it. There was no fighting against this. There was no attempt to compress winter's long darkness into a rigid 8 hours and then force the body awake regardless of whether the sun had risen. The day breathed. It expanded and contracted with the seasons, and the human body, intimately tuned to that breathing rhythm across millions of years of evolution, breathed with it. None of this means ancient life was without urgency or danger. A predator's approach, an injury, a sudden storm, these produced sharp, immediate stress responses, the kind any human nervous system is built to handle. But these responses had a beginning and a clear, resolving end. The danger passed, or it was confronted, and the body returned to its baseline state. There was no equivalent of a deadline silently approaching in the background of an otherwise calm afternoon, manufacturing a low hum of anxiety about a threat that was not actually present in the physical world at all. Children, too, grew up inside this rhythm rather than against it. There was no concept of a child needing to be a certain number of years old before reaching a designated milestone enforced by an external timeline. A child learned to track an animal, to identify edible plants, to read the sky for signs of weather whenever their own readiness and curiosity aligned with opportunity. Sometimes earlier than their peers, sometimes later, with neither being treated as a deviation from a schedule, because no schedule existed to deviate from. Seasonal time, rather than clock time, shaped the largest rhythms of ancient human life. The return of migrating herds, the ripening of particular fruits, the flooding or retreat of a river. These were the true markers of time for your ancestors, not abstract numbers, but observable, lived changes in the world around them. A season did not begin on a fixed calendar date. It began when the first buds appeared, when the first herd was spotted moving along its ancient route, when the nights began noticeably lengthening. Time, in this sense, was not something ancient humans measured. It was something they witnessed, continuously, through direct relationship with the living world around them. This is perhaps the most striking difference of all. For your ancestors, time was not a resource to be spent, saved, wasted, or run out of. It was simply the medium in which life happened, indistinguishable from the rising and setting of the sun, the turning of the seasons, the rhythm of their own breathing bodies. There was nothing to check. There was nothing to be late for. There was only the day, unfolding exactly as long as it needed to, and a human being moving through it according to the oldest guidance system ever built, the body itself, finely tuned by hundreds of thousands of years to know, without being told, precisely when to rise, when to work, when to rest, and when to simply sit by the fire and let the night stretch on for as long as the conversation lasted. And yet, even without a clock, your ancestors were not without ways to mark and understand time. The sky itself became an extraordinary instrument, far older and in some ways far more sophisticated than anything mechanical. The position of the sun across the horizon told a practiced observer roughly how much daylight remained. The phases of the moon, completing their cycle roughly every 29 days, offered a way to track longer stretches of time, often tied to the migration patterns of animals or the ripening of particular plants. Anthropologists studying numerous hunter-gatherer cultures have documented detailed, sophisticated knowledge of star positions used to estimate the progression of the night. Certain constellations rising at certain points signaled how much darkness remained before dawn, information valuable for planning a hunt that needed to begin before first light. This celestial awareness was not abstract knowledge stored for its own sake. It was deeply practical, woven into the texture of survival. Knowing that a particular star cluster rose just before the herds began moving toward water meant a hunter could position himself accordingly, not because a clock told him the hour had arrived, but because the sky itself, observed and understood across a lifetime of attention, communicated everything he needed to know. This was time told not in numbers but in relationships, the relationship between light and dark, between star and horizon, between hunger and the position of the sun. It required no device. It required only sustained, careful attention to a world that was itself, constantly telling time in its own ancient language. This was not a simpler version of being human. It was, in many ways, the original version, the rhythm your body still carries inside it today, encoded in every cell, waiting quietly beneath the surface of a world that for nearly all of human history never once asked you what time it was.